Hello, everybody, and welcome to another edition of Your Gardening Week. This is the spot you can come every Monday to get some great gardening information and get your gardening questions answered. I'm Gardener Scott, and I discuss everything gardening so that you can become a better gardener. Let's go ahead and start with a question from GDK Mouse, who asks, if the soil in my raised bed is mainly potting compost and almost no topsoil, should I be adding topsoil to it? It is almost a foot deep, so it can get very dry quite quickly. Well, right off the bat, I've covered this in some earlier videos, but be careful when you talk about topsoil, because if you go to the store and buy a bag of topsoil, there is no telling what you're going to get in that bag. It could have glass or cans. It can be terrible. So what I typically recommend is to take your own soil, your native soil, and yes, add it to your beds. I'm not a huge fan of growing outside in soilless mixtures like you're talking about with nothing but compost. I do think it's important to get some of the minerals that native soil has. I think it's important to get some of the microorganisms that are within your native soil to get started right away. That's what's really going to break down that organic matter and make the nutrients available for your plants. If your soil is absolutely terrible or contaminated, this is the one instance where I might recommend getting something like rock dust or one of those other minerals that you can buy to put in your soil. So yes, put some type of real soil into your bed. Just be careful about whether you buy topsoil to do that, because that's usually not the best option. Welcome, everybody. It's great to see people checking in from Rhode Island and the UK and Kentucky and a lot of the regulars from Canada. It's great to have you here today. As we proceed, by all means, at every step, let me know how your gardening week is going. I've already seen discussions about the lazy bed processes and the winds and the covering, and it's wonderful for all of us to share the information. I had a pretty good gardening week myself that some of you might already be aware of. Yesterday, the Gardener Scott channel went above 100,000 subscribers. And I have many of you to thank for that. And there are many others out there who aren't on today, of course. But that's a huge accomplishment in the YouTube world. Less than 1% of YouTube creators ever reach that point of 100,000 subscribers. It's just blown my mind. It's absolutely insane, but I'm going to keep going, and the numbers keep growing, and it's all thanks to you. So I really appreciate it. That was definitely a highlight of my week. Colleen from Colorado Springs checking in as well. Thank you. Kate Backen from Arizona, Jennifer from Long Island, and Mrs. Marble from Tucson. And this is what I'm talking about. These are the 100,000. We have people in the Gardener Scott community from all over the world. And I expect a couple of my brothers from Vietnam who regularly watch to be checking in here soon. So what could be better than that? The opportunity to just keep growing the gardening community one person at a time, and the Gardener Scott channel apparently is a great place to do that. So I'm enjoying this. I'm enjoying getting the information out, and I thank you so much for participating in this journey that all of us are on. So thank you so much for all of the congratulations and the success. Visalia, California. It's been a while since I've been there. Delaware, Ohio. I've been to Ohio, but I don't think I've been to Delaware, Leslie, so welcome aboard. The Chicken Wire from Montana. I lived in Great Falls for 4 years. I love Montana. I don't get there often enough either. So as we proceed, I mentioned this a couple weeks ago, I am planning to get out and start doing some traveling and visiting a lot of gardens around the world, around the United States for sure. Got to get my own garden built, which is one of the things I've been working on this week, and I'll continue to be working on. But it's going to be a good opportunity for me to get out and share some of your locales. There's Southeast Montana that's checking in. Zimbabwe, Oh, that's awesome. Syracuse, New York, New Jersey, Alabama, Texas, Pittsburgh. Isn't this amazing? And I've said this in some of my videos, particularly my 100th video where I talk about gardening being a global language. We all speak the same. It's plant talk. And so it doesn't matter where we're from, we can all benefit from others. And so as I proceed, throw your questions at me. I'm going to start with some of the questions from last week, but there's a lot of knowledgeable people that are watching this live stream, and they're going to be sharing their information with you along the way. So if you have a question and I don't get to it this week, I'll try to get to it next week, but hopefully one of the people in the chat will be able to give you an answer to your question as well, or at least some additional guidance and sharing experience. So, Mississippi, Carolina, keep checking in. This is absolutely wonderful. We're up to about 100 viewers, and we're only 6 minutes into this live stream. So last week, the question came up about worms in greenhouses and whether that improved the air quality. And I was stumped. And I looked into it, and I'm still not necessarily stumped, but I don't have specific information from any source I could find that said worms can improve the air in any way. Now, I strongly advocate worms in the garden. I have my own worm farm in bins, but as far as improving the air, I can't give you any definite information. They definitely improve the soil. Their worm castings are great amendments for potting soils. If you use a lot of organic material in your soil, it will attract worms. But if you're doing it for the purpose of your air, I think it might be a little lacking in some research-based information. So, sorry I couldn't give you a definite answer about worms and air, but that's the best I can do. Okay, so last week, 5-Minute Gardener Daily and Night from the UK said, currently looking into keeping chickens in my backyard. Do you have any experience with keeping chickens or plans to do so? And the answer is yes to both of those. I have kept chickens in the past. It was at a property we had about 10 years ago, and I had converted one of the stalls, the horse stalls in our barn, into a chicken coop because it's extremely cold in my area. In the winter, and I wanted to be sure to give my chickens as much protection as possible. And we had ranged between 4 and 5 chickens at the time, enough to give us all the eggs we possibly needed. When I had chickens, I developed my coop in such a way that I had automatic feeders, automatic waterers, and set it up in such a way that I really only needed to add more bedding to the floor about once every 3 or 4 months. I tried to keep it as little labor as possible. I am planning on doing chickens again here in my new garden, but we're probably at least one, probably 2 years away from that. So I'll be doing videos about chickens when that time comes, but it's going to be sometime in the future. Okay, Kay Batkin is asking suggestions on growing grapes. Fungus grows so fast I can't seem to stop it. I don't have a big fungus problem in my area just because it's so dry, but for the regions that have a lot of moisture and fungus developing, whether it's on grapes or any other plant for that matter, air circulation really is the best thing you can do for your plants. And what that means is pruning. So if you're growing your grapes in a section where there's not a lot of air circulation, or you're not pruning the grapes so that you've got a lot of leaves, a lot of branches, a lot of fruit, what happens is fungus can set in when it finds that warm, wet environment. So do what you can to prune away some of the leaves, prune away some of the branches to increase the circulation of the air as it blows through, and that's one of the best ways that you can reduce some of the fungus issues. Okay, so last week We also had a break in the stream while I was talking about one of the main issues of the day. So I'm going to quickly surmise some of what I was talking about and then move into an area I want to talk about this week that ties into it as well. And that's talking about your last frost date and how it correlates with a zone. So your zone is based on your average lowest temperature of the year. That will determine what zone you're in. I'm in zone 5B because over time my average lowest temperature is minus 15 degrees Fahrenheit. That has no impact or effect or concern for you in your vegetable garden. In your vegetable garden, everything should be based around your last frost date. And last week we had a lot of people introducing their zones, their last frost dates. And in zone 5B, for example, we had people who had their average last frost date range from April to June. And my last frost is in May. So bring that into consideration when you're putting your plants in. Don't put your vegetables in your garden based on your zone and automatically assume that it's the right time. Instead, find out your last frost date and put the plants in based on the last frost date. And this ties into a new subject, and I want you to tell me about your experiences with this. And it's the idea of a false spring. Because it's so easy to get lulled into a sense of calm. The weather's warming. It's time to put plants out. Today, I'm supposed to get up to 75 degrees Fahrenheit. And in a couple days, it's supposed to get up into the 80s, which for the end of April and beginning of May is very high. We may even set some high temperature records this week. A lot of people move to Colorado, where I live, and they see the warm weather in May and they start putting their plants in the ground. Well, we are still 3 weeks away from my last frost date, and we're 5 weeks away from when I put my tomato plants and pepper plants in the ground. So don't get lulled into the sense of a false spring. If you're new to gardening and new to your area, talk to the other gardeners and find out what they recommend when it comes to putting your plants in the ground. Because we know, living in Colorado, in my area, that we will have freezing conditions again, with a high likelihood of snow. Even after 80-degree days, we're going to have changes. So imagine that you have a garden outside the United States and you go from 25 degrees Celsius to 0 within a couple days. That's what we experience here in my area in Colorado every single year. It's because of a false spring. Don't fall victim to a false spring. Okay, so Mrs. Marvel is saying when she was in zone 5, the weather fluctuated often, very deceptive. We've had Mother's Day blizzards. And Mother's Day is one of those days that a lot of people who live in cold regions use as a guideline for planting. Don't plant until after Mother's Day. Well, yes, exactly as pointed out, if you live in South Dakota or Colorado, some of those days might be general guidelines, but be careful about it. So what I suggest, particularly when that false spring hits, is get very familiar with weather forecasts and the long range forecasts, and pay attention to what your local gardeners are telling you. So if you're approaching that Mother's Day point and you're being told that's when to plant, don't just blindly follow that. Look into the forecast and find out if it really is a good idea, because you might be able to see that there is a storm coming. Mia Nani says in 1988 we had a ½ inch of snow on May 31st, an hour north of Pittsburgh. And even ½ inch of snow with the weather that cold is enough to stunt, if not kill, your squash and your peppers and your tomatoes and your melons. So be smart a little bit when it comes to putting your plants in the ground. Learn the lessons of those who have come before you, and it could save you some disaster in your garden. Okay, Painting Tracy last week asked, what do you think of square foot gardening for potatoes? Well, coincidentally, my video coming out on Wednesday is going to be all about square foot gardening and getting started with using it in your garden. I don't use it in every single bed, but I'm going to show you how to do it in one of my beds this year. So a lot of information coming out as to what square foot gardening is and how to do it. So if you're not familiar with that, look for the video that's coming on Wednesday. As to potatoes, yes, you could use square foot gardening methods for potatoes. I don't necessarily think that's what it's ideally suited for. It's really suited best for growing a lot of different plants in a small area. Like say growing 8 or 12 different types of vegetables within one vegetable bed. That's what it's best suited for. But when you start getting plants like potatoes that really start spreading out, it could interfere with a lot of those other plants. And so the idea of square foot gardening is you're growing one type of plant in a square foot, and then you're growing a different type of plant in the square foot right next to that square foot. And that's how you set up your entire bed. Well, potatoes in particular, as they start growing and as those tubers start expanding, will take up a lot of space. I think they'll take up more space than even what they suggest will happen in the book Square Foot Gardening. And so why this is such an effective method is because you'll harvest 1 square foot and then put another type of plant in that same square foot while the rest of the garden continues to grow. Well, when you harvest potatoes, you're really disrupting the space around that plant to the point that you're most likely going to be disrupting other plants in the bed if you're practicing square foot gardening. So I don't recommend potatoes and square foot gardening. Instead, grow your potatoes in a bed, a few plants, grow them in towers, grow them in buckets, and kind of avoid the square foot gardening principles for those type of plants. Okay, Philip Vaughn, I've had bad luck with celery in the past. Can you give advice? I can give advice, but it might not be the best advice because I have had no luck with celery either. So even when you know what you're doing, there are some plants that are just hard to grow. For me, it's my region. Celery likes consistently moist soil. It doesn't like dry, hot, windy conditions. And I live in an area with a lot of hot, dry, windy conditions. If you can grow your celery in a protected area with some shade and a consistently moist, rich soil, you might have some success with your celery. You might also just need to write it off and realize that it's not going to grow well in your area. That's what I've done. I don't grow celery. I don't know any gardeners in my area that grow celery because it's just not the right region. And that might be the best advice is, again, get to know other gardeners. Ask around in your area. Go to your local extension office. See what they recommend. And you may find out that the best advice is just don't try to grow it in your area. Okay. Colleen C., can you plant tomatoes, peppers, etc. earlier than 2 weeks after your last frost date under a hoop house? Maybe. So a hoop house, as I've said in some of my earlier videos, if it's just a single sheet of plastic, might give you 3 to 4 degrees Fahrenheit. That's only 1 or 2 degrees Celsius of protection. So if you live in an area where the weather and the climate is very gradual of a change in the spring, then that extra 3 or 4 degrees of protection may be enough if you suddenly get a change in your weather. But as I started off talking, I can get some drastic changes in my weather within a couple weeks, both on the front side and the back side of the last frost date. And even though I like to use hoop houses to protect my plants, my cool season plants, to get a head start on them, I will use hoop houses over those plants that you describe, but after the last frost date, and primarily to help warm the soil so that when I put them in the ground 2 weeks after my last frost date, the soil is warm, the air is warm, and the plants will do fine. For 2 weeks before, it's often not enough protection. Now, I have used wall of waters, and wall of waters do give enough extra protection to start 2 weeks early. I have a video that talks about some of that to show you how to set up a wall of water system. But that water that surrounds the plant gives way more than 3 to 4 degrees. It can give probably as much as 10 or 15 degrees of extra protection. And I have grown tomatoes in my wall of water 2 weeks before my last frost date and had the plants survive snow and temperatures that were 5, 8 degrees below freezing. So be careful about using hoops and plastic that much earlier than your last frost date. If you're looking at the long range forecast, then yes, it might be enough, but just be careful about that. Okay, Miller's Garden last week was asking, I'm in New York. I purchased a pack of strawberry roots from Lowe's. How do I start the roots indoors as it is still cold in New York? Strawberries can take a lot of cold. And in this week, from when the question was asked in the last live stream, it's probably warmed up enough. Bare root strawberry plants should go straight into the ground. There's really no reason to start them indoors. And when they start to grow, they'll grow through the cold that'll happen. The strawberries that I had in the ground from last year that started growing about 2 weeks ago, almost 3 weeks ago now. Well, a week and a half ago, our temperatures dropped down to 14 degrees overnight, which is enough to kill most plants. And they actually did some serious damage, and I lost some of the cool season plants that I had in hoop houses. With the strawberries that had no protection whatsoever were unaffected by that severe cold. Some of the outer leaves were affected, but the inner plant continued to grow. So you don't need to start strawberries indoors, especially bare root strawberries. Put them outside, mulch well so the soil temperature stays moderated, and you should be able to do fine. Okay, Luciano Cordova, what are your thoughts on liquid manure? And I'm not sure exactly. Go ahead and ask some more about that as we proceed. Manures in general can be very good as soil amendments. You have to be careful about the source of the manure because horse manures, for instance, can have a lot of salt in them. They can have a lot of weed seeds in them. If the horses are grazing on open pasture land and then near the barn they have salt licks, you could have some serious issues if you use that manure in your garden. But a lot of other manures, chicken manures, no problem whatsoever. Rabbit manure, no issue at all. Alpaca manure is amazing. And so as far as the liquid manure, if you're talking about like a manure tea where you're taking some of those manures and then putting it into a bucket of water, letting it steep for a while, and then using that liquid manure as a fertilizer in your garden, sure, that can be very beneficial at all. It's a lot like compost tea in my mind, which is if you use the manure in your soil, I think it adds many more benefits than if you were to use it as a tea to fertilize your plants. So let's see if I don't see anything else coming up as to what the liquid manure idea was or what it means, but use it as a soil amendment rather than as a tea or in a liquid form, and I think you'll probably get better results. Okay, last week, Liliette Cardoso was asking, how much water should I give my tomato transplants after I planted them in raised beds? And this is one of those questions that all of us would give you a different answer based on where we live. Because of my dry, hot, windy conditions, I often have to water my plants every single day, sometimes even twice a day when they're young seedlings. The key is to keep the soil consistently moist at the level of the roots. So when you put tomato seedlings into the ground, I'm assuming that the roots are only going to be 3, maybe 4 inches deep. So you need to water as often as you need to keep the soil moist at 3 to 4 inches deep. Once the plants have grown and the roots are spreading out and going deeper, you may be able to get away with watering every 2 or 3 days. A really deep watering that is able to sustain the soil moisture deeper in the bed. My soil dries out the top half inch or so within an hour. And so I recommend mulch. I use a lot of mulch to reduce the soil evaporation levels, and then water as often as needed to keep the soil consistently moist for the seedlings to grow. You've got to figure out for yourself whether that means twice a day or every other day. And get in there with your finger. Actually dig in your soil with your finger to see how moist the soil is at different depths, and that'll help you give you some guidelines as to how often that you want to water. So we're up to over 150 viewers. Thank you everybody for watching today. The questions are pouring in. I do need to mention something because I saw a few questions that came up last week because they didn't know what it meant. Because I'll talk about the super chat. If someone gives me a super chat, almost always I stop what I'm doing and I acknowledge the super chat. And people that realize that they have a burning question that needs to be answered, if they put that question in a super chat, I'll answer the question. Okay? So right now, Jay Wells just gave me an amazing $20 super chat. Okay, so this question, which is what I'm going to now put at the top of the list of questions. We have no frost day here in Los Angeles and so many hungry people. I'm dying to know how we as gardeners can organize to turn public spaces into food forests. Is there any precedent for that? Thanks, Gardener Scott. So what just happened, for those of you that don't know how this works, and this is why I wanted to bring it up, not because I'm looking for contributions, but just to give you an understanding of how YouTube works, is at the bottom of the comments, you should see a little smiley face and a little dollar sign. I'm not sure if the sign changes if you're in another country. If you click on the little smiley face, it gives you the option to use some different emojis. But if you click on that dollar symbol or whatever it is in your country, it gives you the opportunity to make a donation to the Gardener Scott channel. And it highlights it with a different color based on how much you give. So Jay Wells gave $20 on my screen. That's a highlighted orange, and it goes to the very top of the chat to say that this happened. And it identifies for me the opportunity to start answering the question. So absolutely no obligation for a live chat. But if you want to contribute, or if you want to be sure that your question is answered, that's a good way to do it. And so, great question as to how we gardeners can organize and turn public spaces into food forests. It's very difficult, and there are precedents for this. Look in your community, and you might find, excuse me, that there's already an organization that does something like this. So just up the road from me, there's an organization called Denver Urban Gardens. And here in Colorado Springs, there's a gardening friend of mine who started Pikes Peak Urban Gardens. And in many communities around the country and around the world, urban gardening is this concept where, like, you take a public space and turn it into either individual opportunities for gardeners or sometimes large-scale opportunities. If you do a search of urban gardens in Los Angeles or Los Angeles urban gardens, you might find organizations that are already doing this. And so you and other gardeners might be able to join an organization like that. If you don't see it, then you might actually be able to start it. So there is precedent out there for these type of things, especially in a city as large as Los Angeles. You might have some urban guerrilla gardening organizations. And so look that up as well, because there are some very famous ones that, like in Pittsburgh, for instance, in Philadelphia, where they have this urban guerrilla mindset, and they'll go in to usually poorer sections of the town, sections where the buildings are crumbling and things are falling apart, and they'll revitalize entire city lots into food forests and areas for the community to garden. So there's lots of precedent for this. You just need to look it up and try to find it. If your area is small enough that the organization doesn't exist, then maybe you can start with a gardening club, and the gardening club can do this. And so I live in an area pretty small outside of Colorado Springs, but our library our library hosts our garden club, and our garden club has reclaimed some land around that library to do this same kind of thing. So lots of precedent. You need to look for it, but it's probably out there. So Fleming 1210 Johansson, thank you for the super chat. And I'm glad that I can inspire you. That's why I do it. Cheers to you as well. I started a couple years ago getting serious about the Gardener Scott channel, partly because of inspiration. And I'm planning on actually talking about it because I've been thinking about this all morning. I'm going to be doing a video on Sunday where I talk about the inspiration and why I do this. I've had the philosophy for a long time that if I can just help one other gardener to learn to garden and become a better gardener, then I've made the world a better place. And that's why I do this channel and why I make these videos, is to try to find one gardener to inspire. Because it's a pay it forward idea. If that one gardener can now pass that inspiration and then enthusiasm to an additional gardener, well, imagine what the world would be if every single person just helped one more. It just grows exponentially. Well, what's amazing to me is that I now have 100,000 subscribers on the Gardener Scott channel. And actually, we've increased that by about 2,000 just since yesterday. So I am doing this to inspire you, and I appreciate the feedback when you let me know that the inspiration is working. And I just encourage you to help spread that inspiration to the other gardeners out there, because there's a lot of people that are turning to gardening in the world today because they're worried about the food supply. They want to supply food for their families. Well, those of us, through information on my channel and all the many others, the gardeners that are just discovering it now can become successful gardeners. And if all of us help all of the rest of us, like you already do in the chat section, what a wonderful world this will be. So thank you so much for that super chat. Thank you so much for the information coming out. Brandon, thanks for checking in from Fountain, just down the road from me. That's wonderful. And I do appreciate all of your support, and I like what I'm doing. So I'm going to keep doing it, and I appreciate that you like that I'm doing it as well. And so let's talk about Marie Quite Contrary, who last week asked, how does elevation change things for me? And so far, all these people that have been checking in from Colorado, be it from Denver or Colorado Springs or Fountain, we all live at very high elevation, and it does make gardening more challenging. For one thing, we are 5,000 or 7,000 feet closer to the sun And so right off the bat, I'll say it's harder on us as gardeners because the sun is more intense. So I always wear a hat and sunscreen when I garden. I don't do it in my videos anymore just because I think it disrupts some of the video of my face because I know you like to see my face, but it makes it more important to wear self-protective equipment in the garden because we're closer to the sun. For us in particular, it also means that the sun is more intense, the air tends to be drier, and so the wind tends to be drier, which means it's more difficult for the plants to grow. So we have to take that into consideration. I use a lot more shade cloth in my garden, partly because I'm at high altitude and the sun is more intense. So during the really hot days of summer, I have to shade some of my plants, even the plants that like a lot of sun. So it does make it more challenging than people that might be growing at sea level or areas that are much more humid. And I've said this before, you've got to learn the conditions in your area. You really need to understand your climate, especially as a new gardener, because your climate will impact how you garden and what plants you can grow. Okay, let's see what else we've got from last week. We had a question that was asking about recycling. Monica M., I'm interested in recycling my used kitchen water into viable water for my garden. Do you know of any resources I can utilize? Is there a way to do it all naturally with plants? And you have to be careful about this because in Colorado, until recently, it was illegal to use any reclaimed water. So do check first to see if you have any type of restrictions on reusing kitchen water. It's called gray water. And so you can actually do some searches on using gray water in my garden, and you'll find a lot of resources out there. It could be as simple as just putting a bucket and collecting some of the water. There's actually ways that you can replumb underneath your sink and you can direct the drainage water into a holding area for your garden. There are resources out there. Look it up as gray water or gray water recycling. And if you put in your locale, you'll probably find some resources and information about it. Okay, John Crawford, another super chat. This is amazing. New gardener here. Is there a cutoff date for starting asparagus? I'm in zone 7 and I need to get more things to make a proper raised bed for it, but current events make it a bit more difficult. That's a really good question, especially as a new gardener. Yes, but probably what you're going to find is the cutoff isn't so much weather related or zone related, but when you go to find the asparagus to put in your garden, you might not really find it. I'm seeing a lot of places are sold out of the asparagus roots because people were ordering back in January and February. So you may have already reached a cutoff point just to be able to order it and find it. As to zone 7, your soil's probably already pretty warm and your weather's probably getting pretty hot, that I would probably advise against starting asparagus roots right now because the spears, as they break ground, are pretty tender of the brand new growth. And it takes weeks from the time that you'll put a root in the ground, water it, and then the spear breaks soil surface. And so those tender spears are probably going to be exposed to some really hot conditions by the time they grow in your area. So I'm not saying don't do it, but if you do it, put the asparagus in a bed like I just talked about with shade cloth. Put them in an area where they're protected from shade cloth so they're not going to be burned, and you might be able to go ahead and start asparagus if you do it right now. A better option might be to get some asparagus seeds, start the asparagus from seed indoors, grow them all summer long into the fall, And then in the course of the next 3 or 4 or 5 months, the asparagus that you're growing from seed will reach the point that you can transplant them in the fall, and you might get a head start that way. And I experimented that with 1 year here, where I grew asparagus indoors and then I put them outside. For me, I think it was September. And I really didn't think I was going to have much success with it. So I planted them pretty close together, expecting a lot of the plants to die, and pretty much all of them came back the next spring. And so now I had a bed of asparagus with the plants much too close together. So that might be an option for you, especially as a new gardener, to learn some new things about growing plants. But as for growing from the roots, I would probably advise, or I should say my best advice would be get a bed area, or get a bed area ready, put a lot of organic material into it, allow it to start developing over the course of this next year, and then put the roots in early spring next year, and you'll probably have the best results for that. So thanks, great question. I appreciate you asking that. Okay, looking into a question from Simo Farm Boy last week. Why would my tomatoes not be producing but 1 or 2 tomatoes a year? And so my first answer to that would be probably your soil. If your soil is good, whatever plants you put into it, you should get good results. When plants are stressed, they're going to put all of their energy into just 1 or 2 fruit. They might have more flowers than that, but the focus is going to be on just trying to get a couple fruit to survive. So you might have soil that's deficient in the macronutrients and some of the micronutrients that tomatoes need. If you suspect that could be it, go ahead and get a soil test. And this holds true to all of you. If you see your plants just aren't producing the way you think they should, start thinking about the soil. 80% of plant problems can be traced to the soil. A simple fertilization might be a quick solution to get your plants growing again. It could also be the type of plant you're growing. There are some tomatoes that in different regions just don't produce a lot. Brandywine tomatoes in my area just don't do well. They take a long time to produce fruit. The conditions almost have to be perfect. Every time I've tried to grow a brandywine tomato in my garden, even with good soil, I only got 1 or 2 fruit because the plant just needed conditions that I couldn't provide. If the weather changes dramatically while the plant is setting flower, the pollination can stop. If the temperatures are above 90 degrees Fahrenheit during the day and below 50 degrees Fahrenheit at night, those flowers probably won't pollinate. So that could be a big issue. So if you're putting your tomatoes in the ground too early or too late and the weather is impacting the blossoms and the pollination, you might only get a couple fruit to develop. So look at all of those factors and try to determine for yourself if some of those are at play, and that might be a reason that your tomato plants aren't producing. Okay, J-Mom is asking another question about asparagus. Can you and when can you dig up an existing plant to transplant it? Do it when it's dormant. That's the best time. And that, in most cases for asparagus, is in early spring. That's a big reason why when you order asparagus roots, they're going to come in a dormant stage in early spring, because that's the best time to dig them up and transplant them. They don't like to have their roots disturbed. So if you try to dig up a growing plant and then transplant it, you might have success, but probably not. So wait until they're dormant. That's the best time to do it. Okay. Luciano Cordova is saying possibly potassium deficiency in soil. Soil is critical for everything you grow. That's why I suggest getting a soil test done if you're new to gardening or if you're starting a new garden. Figure out your baseline. I know my soil is deficient. My native soil is deficient in nitrogen and phosphorus and potassium, but it's also high in some of the other micronutrients. Because I know that, I can really focus my fertilization for my plants. So this year, I'm not going to worry a lot about micronutrients, but I will be fertilizing some of my plants with a balanced fertilizer. I will also continue to amend my soil with organic material like compost, because over time, when my soil microorganisms just become extremely healthy, they'll be breaking down that organic matter into all of the nutrients that the plants will need. So consider deficiencies within your soil as a primary cause for a lot of problems that could develop. Okay, Susie June, I'm at 7,500 feet elevation in Golden, Colorado. That's even higher than me, I think. What is a better tomato to grow at higher elevation? There's a lot of varieties out there. Russian varieties, believe it or not, are some of the tastiest tomatoes, and they grow in areas where the weather can be quite harsh, to include the cold. And that's one of the biggest issues when you're growing at high elevation, is in addition to the things I already talked about, it's that the nights tend to be colder as well. Black Krim is one of my favorite tomatoes. It does great. It's a Russian tomato that comes from the Crimea, and most people I know across the Front Range here grow it and have great success with it. You can also look at some of the varieties that come from northern areas around the United States. Glacier is actually the name of a tomato variety that is specifically suited for cold areas with short seasons. So look at the tomato that you might be considering, and you want to get a short season variety, the type that should be ready to harvest in about 70 days or 75 days. Those are the ones you're going to have the most success with. Stay away completely from tomato varieties that say 90, 100, or 110 days to harvest, because typically they're going to require the kind of conditions that those of us that live in the mountains just can't give our plants. Okay, let's get back to another question from last week. Klim Chef was asking, can I till half decomposed compost in my garden 4 weeks before transplanting and sowing? Yes, you can. And I, again, say compost in your soil is a good thing. And I think why you're asking this question is because of the concern if you use partially decomposed compost, or if you're using fresh grass or leaves, if you're putting anything into your soil that has not fully decomposed, then it will take nitrogen to jumpstart that decomposition. And that's what they call robbing the soil. You'll see references to nitrogen robbing or nitrogen stealing. And that's because that organic material is taking nitrogen from the soil to decompose. After it's decomposed, it will give that nitrogen back to the soil. But there is a time period where it's robbing nitrogen from any plants that you put into the ground. 4 weeks gives a pretty good amount of time for that decomposition to continue. If you keep your soil evenly moist during that 4 weeks before you put plants in the ground, there's going to be a lot of decomposition, and that nitrogen balance will probably be moderated to the point that it's not going to adversely affect your plants a lot. But that being said, I would suggest fertilizing with nitrogen fertilizers as those plants are growing. So putting seedlings into the ground in an area that has just recently had organic matter added to it, go ahead and plan within that first month of transplanting to use a balanced fertilizer to get some of those nutrients back into the soil. After a few months, it's not as necessary, and you probably don't need to worry about fertilization much at all. We'll talk more about that during the growing season when I can have examples and make some videos. I'm not a huge fan of a lot of fertilizer on a regular basis. Instead, I think it's more important to amend the soil. So you're on the right track, keep amending the soil, just be ready to add some fertilization that includes nitrogen if you're putting the plants in the ground before the soil microorganisms have had a time to break it all down. So Tennessee Bushcrafter saying that you love brandywine and black creme in the ground as well. That's one of I wish I could grow brandywine. It's touted as one of the best tomatoes out there. I've only tasted one in my life because I had one that grew on a plant one year. It was delicious, but it just takes too much effort for me to grow. And so moving forward in your season, think about that aspect as well. In your garden journal, when you're keeping track of your plants and how well they do, really focus on how hard it is to grow a plant. And if it's too hard, then don't grow it again. I have a lot of plants I would really like to grow. Okra falls into that category. It's hard. It takes a lot of extra effort for me to grow brandywine tomatoes, okra, celery. So I just don't grow those at all because I don't think they're worth the extra effort. If what you're growing is worth it, for whatever reason, then by all means do it. But start looking at your garden from a labor perspective. And if you can save labor on the efforts it would take to grow a plant like that, and put that effort into another plant that is much easier to grow, well, you might be able to grow twice as much of that other plant. So add that to your list of considerations for your gardening year, is tracking the effort that you're making in the garden, that labor component. And for next year, see how you can modify that a little bit. Okay, so Nicholas writes, if I'm keeping biennial plants for seed cultivating, do I need to protect them from snow and freezing ground during the winter in southwest Michigan? Excellent question. And so a biennial plant, and I'll use carrots as an example, because for some reason that I can't explain, my video on how to collect carrot seeds has just exploded and is going viral. I'm getting over 25,000 views on this carrot video that I did almost 2 years ago. It is a really good video, but it just amazes me that for some reason right now it's exploding. And so I'll use this to answer your question. And I suggest if you haven't seen that video, go ahead and look at the video because it answers a lot of your questions as well. And so the idea is that you have annual plants that most of us are growing in our vegetable gardens, and they'll die at the end of the season when exposed to cold. And then you've got perennial plants in other areas of your garden that come back every single year. Well, biennial plants are in between. They don't die after the first year. They come back the second year, and they produce flowers and seeds in that second year. And I don't get confused here. Let me rephrase that to be second season, because the whole process takes about a year. You start them this season, they'll overwinter, and then next season they'll flower and collect the seeds. If it's a biennial, it is designed by nature to survive winter and then come back in the spring. So do a little research for whatever types you're trying to grow, what the biennials are, and you might find out a zone recommendation because they have to survive the winter. A lot of biennials will give you an indication of how cold the temperatures can be for them to survive winter. But in most cases, biennials will survive most winters, and then you'll be able to harvest them. Almost all carrots, for example. In fact, I don't know of a carrot that won't survive most winters. So go ahead and do it and expect that they should survive. The best answer, of course, is just try it. If they didn't survive, now you know for next time. But beets and a lot of the root crops are biennials. You have to leave them in the ground to get flowering, or the best flowering and seeding, and they'll overwinter just fine. Okay, Laura Bahena, thank you so much for the super chat. Is alfalfa meal a good soil amendment? How would you suggest using it? Yes, alfalfa is actually very good to use as a soil amendment by itself. It's packed with nutrients, which is why it's fed to livestock. When the livestock eat the alfalfa, they're getting all of the nutrients that are packed within that plant. So it's an excellent soil amendment by itself. When it's packed into the alfalfa meal, now all of that is condensed into even a more nutrient rich product. It is good to add to your soil. What I would suggest, however, to get the biggest benefit from it is to use it in your compost pile because it's very nitrogen rich. And most compost piles have that problem with nitrogen deficiency. So it can be a great way to boost the nitrogen in your compost pile. If you've got dried grass, dried leaves, a lot of other brown dying plants, the alfalfa pellets can boost your pile and give you rich compost very quickly. So that's my best recommendation for the way to use it. You kind of have to be careful because it's so rich in nutrients, especially nitrogen, that if you put the pellets directly into your soil and then plant, you could actually cause some damage to the roots that reach that because it's just so rich in nutrients. So if you're going to add it directly to the soil, I would encourage that you crush the alfalfa meal if it's in pellet form. If it's as a meal and already crushed, you might be able to go ahead and use it into the soil right away. But this gets back to that question about how soon you put things in your garden and how soon you plant. It's a kind of an opposite problem because it's adding so much nitrogen to the soil. I would still allow some time for it to buffer and moderate the soil and microorganism levels. So you can put it directly into the soil, but allow 3 or 4 weeks for it to moderate within that soil before you put the plants in. But yes, definitely. I've seen some concerns as to the cost. If you're planning to use it for the fertilization benefits, there are other materials you could use at less cost. But if you're getting your alfalfa meal at affordable rates, or if you're using it, and this is what I used to do in the barn when we would feed the horses alfalfa, sweep up everything that fell into the bedding and use that bedding that has the alfalfa in it and put that into your compost pile as well, because you've got ingredients like straw that are very low in nitrogen, and then you have the alfalfa meal that's very high in nitrogen. That's ideally suited for a compost pile. So definitely use it. Definitely use it in compost. Consider using it with some limitations as a direct soil amendment. So thanks for asking that. That was a really good question. And thanks again for the super chat donation. Okay, this ties in with a question that was asked last week by PVC 9x1. Is it normal for a hot compost pile to cool down below the active temperature when the temperature drops? I wonder if I just did something wrong or if it is truly cooler because of the weather. So yes, a pile can cool down because of the weather. It usually requires a substantial drop in the air temperature to cool the temperature of a hot pile. More likely, the temperature drop of the hot pile is because the bacteria ate all the food, or there wasn't enough nitrogen to support the hot pile. So this is a great way to use alfalfa in your pile. If you notice that your hot pile is dropping in temperature, give it a real quick organic nitrogen boost with something like alfalfa meal, and you should see the temperature increase. If you suspect it's because of the weather and because of the cooler temperatures, then you can mitigate some of those issues. If you see the forecast is coming for a really cold night, then take plastic or a tarp and throw it over your pile to hold in that hot temperature during those really cold conditions. The outside of the pile, it's normal for it to cool when the air temperature drops. The inside of the pile shouldn't drop dramatically. It shouldn't be that noticeable. And so that's why I suspect that it might be an issue with the food and the nitrogen levels within the pile. But if you practice hot composting and you want to keep the pile hot, especially the outside of the pile, go ahead and cover it in cold conditions. One of the other things you can do to jumpstart a pile is add oxygen. So if you haven't turned your pile in a while and you're noticing the temperature is falling, you might need to turn it and boost some of the oxygen levels within that pile. Okay, love all of the comments coming in. We're up to about 200 viewers. Thank you to everybody. And if you're new to this or if you're watching on replay, I do want to give you this bit of information because this question has come up occasionally as well. This live stream will come back as a video. It's automatic. YouTube records it and then YouTube releases it as a video. I think it takes about an hour and a half. So if you're just logging in and you missed all of the stuff we talked about earlier in the video, you can watch it on replay at any time, just like you would another video. It's also one of those things that if you've just discovered the live stream and you're not sure if you can make the live streams in the future, they happen every Monday. It's 11 o'clock Eastern time, 9 o'clock Mountain time for me. You can join at any time. It's going to be about 90 minutes long. Takes me a couple days, but about 2 days after the live stream, I'll put links to all of these topics that we're discussing. So if you watch the live stream, I answered a question, it piqued your interest, it's something you want to do in the garden, and then a week or two goes by and you forget what it was that we talked about, well, you can go back to the video of the live chat and I'll have the minutes broken down. So you can go right to the answer to that specific question. So I encourage you to use these live streams as a resource for your future gardening because you'll be able to go back, and I've done this with all the other live streams if you didn't know that. All of the previous live streams, I have gone back and I put a timestamp for all of the topics that were discussed. So if you remember something that happened in the past and you want to remember it again, just check out the video and you'll be able to go right to that information. So thank you for everybody that has given me the support, over 200 live streamers now, and I'd love to see it grow. I see a lot of you checking in. Let me answer Karen's question. And so she did something that's also really smart. If you do the super chat, it jumps right to the top of the list. As I'm talking and answering questions, and you know I like to give thorough answers, I might miss a question that pops up in the chat. It's more likely that I will see the question if you type in Gardner Scott. And so that's what Karen Colson did. She typed in Gardner Scott, it highlights it on my screen, and then she asks, can I pollinate cucumbers or do they pollinate themselves? The answer to that question is both. Cucumbers will pollinate themselves. They will also be pollinated by insects, and you can also hand pollinate your cucumbers. It's a lot of work. If you want to start practicing with hand pollinating, it's a great skill for gardeners to learn. And so I suggest starting with something like a squash plant that has huge flowers. And I'll show you how to do this in an upcoming video once my squash gets to the point that I can show you how to do it. You can do the same thing with cucumbers. You take a paintbrush and you go from one flower with the paintbrush to get the pollen on it. And then you go to the next flower and use the same paintbrush. And so you can hand pollinate all of your blossoms. This can be important if you're growing cucumbers in a greenhouse that doesn't have insects. Most often what happens is the wind blowing and the insects, that'll be enough to pollinate all of the cucumbers you have growing outside. But if you're growing in an environment like a greenhouse where the plants are very still, then you might not get the pollination. So go ahead and get a paintbrush out there and you can hand pollinate. Even in the greenhouse, I never saw that necessary with my cucumbers, but it is something to consider. P. Mantis is asking, will iris survive transplant in New York in April? It's cool, it's rainy here. My neighbor put them out today. Yeah, they should. You might not get any flowers. You might not get a lot of growth. Irises are typically put in later in the year. If they're in the ground now, there's really not much you can do about it. Go ahead and keep an eye on them, but you can fully expect that they're going to grow. They'll probably survive without too much issue. There might be some loss. The rhizomes of the irises should have enough energy to get the plant through the warm weather and the summer. Just make sure to advise your neighbor to keep all of the foliage. Don't cut it back, because that foliage is going to put the energy back into the rhizome, and that's what the plant's going to need to survive through the winter. And so it might be a little bit stressed by planting them now, which is why it's going to need all of that foliage to put the energy back into the rhizome. Okay, so another question from last week. This comes from Christina Chico. How can I avoid stressing my plants when I transfer them from the nursery small cubes to my top bed? Haven't had success with this. We talked a little bit about this last week, and I think even the week before. Hardening off really is necessary for most plants that you're going to get from a nursery or that you've started indoors yourself. Hardening off is a gradual exposure to the conditions of your garden. So you take a plant that you got from the nursery or from your basement or wherever you're starting your plants, and you put them outside in a protected area for a couple hours just to let them know that they need to start acclimating to the weather. And then you bring them inside to a protected area. And then the next day you put them outside for a little bit longer and you bring them back inside. And this process should take between 5 and 10 days, depending on how big the plant is and how sturdy and strong it's already developed. But especially for the smaller plants that come in those little pots that you get from the nursery, they're probably pretty tender. They've been growing inside. Now, they might have been exposed to some natural sunlight, but they haven't been exposed to cool temperatures at nighttime. By hardening them off over a period of time where you gradually expose them to your garden conditions, you will have more success. And that last day of hardening off, you want to put them outside all day, leave them outside overnight, and after that, you put them into the ground. Hardening off just during the day is great, but if you don't give your plants exposure to the cool nighttime temperatures, and that means the very first time they're going to even be exposed to cool temperatures in their entire lives, it's going to be that first time you put them in the ground out in your garden. And that cool temperature overnight, or those cool breezes overnight, could be enough to stunt and possibly kill your plants. So harden them off, including an overnight hardening off, and you're much more likely to have success in your garden. Crims is asking, is it possible to root an apple branch? Absolutely. That's how the nurseries do it. So the video I just did last night shows how to plant an apple tree and how to prune an apple tree. And in that video, I discussed the grafting point on apple trees. Every apple tree you buy will have a grafting point. The bottom is the rootstock. The top is the tree that will be growing, and it comes from a scion. Both of those were just branches that were clipped off of apple trees. The rootstock is literally a branch that they stick in the ground. It develops roots and starts growing into a tree. they cut it off at some point, and they graft onto it a branch from another tree, and that's the kind of apple tree that they want to grow. Absolutely, you can grow it from a branch stuck in a ground. You don't have to do a separate rootstock. If you want to just cut off a branch of a tree and stick it into the sand to start growing, you'll get that tree. You won't get the same rootstock. So a dwarf tree start growing from a branch that you pruned off will probably grow into a full tree. Aware of the differences in rootstock, but yes, it's absolutely something that could happen. Diane D is asking, my San Marzano, that's a tomato, are not happy. They are limp looking, repotted 2 weeks ago. They are under grow lights, soil is damp. My other types of tomatoes are doing great, which were planted at the same time. So if the lights are consistent, if the watering is consistent, if the timing is consistent, again, it probably gets back to a soil issue. So is the potting soil that you're using, does it have fertilizer in it? I'm going to go ahead and continue. I just got notice that there might be a buffering issue. Apparently my stream is not as strong as it was, but think about the fertilizer that is in your soil or the lack of it. So if there's not enough fertilizer, consider adding it. Just a weakened solution at this point for seedlings because it might be a nutrient issue. But it's also possible that even though everything else is the same, it could be an overwatering or underwatering issue for those specific plants. So check the soil within those individual cells or those individual pots down at root level. That might be another issue that you might have to concern. Diane Matuszewski is asking, what would you suggest on testing soil? Meter or test strip kits? And I apologize because it says we're still not getting smooth streaming. I apologize for the buffering. It's all of the people that are online at the same time, obviously. So for soil testing, I encourage a professional test from a laboratory in the beginning to establish your baseline. From that point on, and if you don't want to take that extra expense, you can use those meters. I don't think they're especially accurate. They can give you a general idea of pH, for instance, but it's not going to be as accurate as a professional soil test. The strips are similar. They'll give you general information. It's not going to be precise. But let's say you just want to know whether your soil is alkaline or acidic because you want to know whether to grow raspberries or blueberries. Well, yeah, you can use a test strip. A test strip is good at giving you a general idea of your pH. If you want to know a very specific pH of your soil, you're going to have to get a soil test professionally done. The same with the nitrogen levels. You can use a test strip or one of those meters to give you an idea of the nitrogen levels within your soil. It'll probably tell you whether it's really bad or really good, but if you really want the precision, you got to get the professional soil test. Okay, so PVC 9x1 had also asked a question last week. You had a video about using wall of water or cozy coats, just a different brand name for the wall of water, to start tomato plants earlier in the garden. Would love to hear how the tomato plants did long term. And so I talked a little bit earlier about using these. Every time that I've used wall of water or cozy coats to get a head start with my tomatoes before my last frost date, the plants did great. There was absolutely no difference in the growth between those plants and all the other plants. It gave me a head start, and so long term, those plants that I started with the wall of water / cozy coats, I got a harvest a couple weeks earlier than all of the other tomatoes that were started after the last frost date. So it's a definite boost in getting to a harvest. No problem at all with the plants getting any type of extra issues or even less issues. Once the plants got to the full grown stage, they were exactly the same. So long term, it gives you a head start on the season, but it really doesn't offer much benefit beyond that. And you take off the wall of water or the cozy coat when it starts getting hot outside, at about the time that you're starting the other tomato plants. So I'll start the wall of water at the beginning of May and put the plants in about a week after that. I don't normally put my tomato plants in the ground until the first week of June. So the wall of water plants have a 3-week advantage, and it's about at that 3-week point that I remove them from the plant and then tie them up to a trellis because they're already taller than everything else at that point usually, and then continue to allow them to grow. Okay, Ralph Gomez. Gardner Scott, I planted ponderosa lemon seeds and now have plants. Will these grow true to the parent? I'm not that familiar with the lemons. My guess off the bat is probably not. Meyer lemon trees are grown from a single Meyer lemon tree, and the guy that grew its name was Meyer. And so just like all apple trees are grown on grafted rootstock, Meyer lemon trees, for example, are all grown and are genetically similar by using the same cutting and grafting system. I don't know specifically about ponderosa lemon, but it's worth a try. You're going to get lemons on the trees more than likely. I just can't guarantee you're going to get the same fruit that you were expecting. It's a great experiment to find out. I've grown plants like that from seed before and found out that the seeds had completely different fruit that tasted completely different. So it's worth a try. You might want to do a little bit of research yourself into the ponderosa lemon and find out if the plants that you got those seeds from were grafted. If they came from grafted lemon trees, then the answer is probably that you're not going to get plants that are true to the parent. Joe Holstein, thanks for the pruning tips. I inherited plum trees which have stuff growing on the bark of the branches. Is that bad for the trees? What do you recommend? Not sure what you mean by stuff growing on the bark, but it's normal for algae, moss, fungi, lots of those kind of things to be growing on the bark of trees. I would try to find out a little bit more about it. So when you say stuff, try to identify and do a search of your own. If it's red, it might be a rust. If it's white, it might be a fungus. If it's green, it might be a moss. So look at the color, look at how it's growing. Do a simple search of what is the white stuff growing on the bark of my plum tree, and you might be surprised that there's probably some answers out there to give you that. If it's something that you can rub off, I would probably suggest rubbing it off, just because it's not normal for things to be growing on bark. If it's something that you can spray off, go ahead and spray it off. If it's something that's only growing on 1 or 2 branches, and you start seeing that those branches, the leaves on those branches don't look right, then you might want to consider pruning off those branches. It's hard to say exactly what it is because it could be so many things, but start looking at what it could, or if it's causing any problems with the tree, and then also doing the search to try to further identify it, and that can give you the solutions as to whether you need to treat the tree, or whether you need to treat that particular area, or whether you need to prune it off completely. Definitely something to consider. Okay, Lisa Gerlach had asked a question. My friend put topsoil in my new raised beds. The bag said for filler and leveling. Am I in trouble? And I touched a little bit about this earlier when I was talking about topsoil. Be careful about using topsoil from bags, because luckily your bag said it's for filling and leveling, which means you shouldn't expect it to have any nutrients within it at all. No organic material. So you're not necessarily in trouble, but what you need to do is start adding organic matter to that topsoil. You need to create an environment for the soil organisms to grow and prosper and turn the nutrients that could be in your soil after you add the amendments, make it suitable for the plants to grow. If you grow plants directly in it right now, they're probably not going to do very well. The soil needs nutrition, and topsoil that's just for leveling probably doesn't have a lot of nutrition in it. Amend your soil regularly, often, and you'll have better results. Okay, let's get to the point in our time when I start talking about some of my philosophy to help you become a better gardener. And this week, I want you to ask why. When I give you suggestions about how to garden or what you should do, don't blindly follow my advice. Ask why. When you see somebody else give you a suggestion or a recommendation, or a book, or a blog, or even a seed packet, if it says to do something a particular way, ask why. And I don't mean this necessarily to question the recommendation because it's wrong, but it's as a way for you to become a better gardener. So when I keep talking on and on about amending your soil, I'll often give you a reason why. I'll say it's because of the bioorganisms within the soil. That by amending it, you're providing food to the bacteria, and that bacteria breaks it down into a nutrient that can be absorbed by the plants. That's one reason why you add soil amendments. There are many more. I try to give you the why as much as possible. I don't always do it. Ask why. Even when I give you the answer, take it another step. This is how you really become a better gardener, is when you start understanding why you do the things that you do, then it makes sense. And you can start identifying problems. You see something within a plant or a tree or a bush, and it's just not going the way it's supposed to go. And you say, I did everything the way that Joe Gardner recommended. Why isn't it working? Well, it might be too late to ask why when the plant is suffering. That's why I'm encouraging to start asking why in the beginning and ask why at every step of the process. And an example that I will use, I've used it before, is wood ashes in the garden. Extremely common worldwide to take wood ash and add it to the garden. And then it just stops there. There are a lot of videos out there with gardeners saying, yep, add wood ash to the garden, you'll get great plants. If you don't ask why, you might be in trouble. Wood ash will cause the soil pH to rise. It makes soil more alkaline. A lot of those people, those gardeners who are telling you to grow or to use wood ash in your garden have acidic soil. And so the wood ash actually helps moderate the pH. It adds a great source of potassium, and plants will do great when you add wood ash to an acidic soil. But if your soil is alkaline and you add wood ash, you may increase the pH to a high enough level that the plants will suffer and potentially die. Don't blindly follow gardening advice without asking why, because that advice may be great for some gardeners, but it's not great for all gardeners. And just by asking the question why to help you become a better gardener so that you understand it, you can solve some of those problems. So you've been told, add wood ash to your garden and nothing beyond that. Before you do it, ask why. It may be perfect, but when you find out the answer, then you'll understand. And that holds true with so many other things, even fertilizers. Everybody recommends adding fertilizers to help your plants grow. Why? Did you know that you can over-fertilize your plants? You can kill your plants with kindness by giving them too much nutrition. If your soil has too much potassium in it, it can actually keep the roots from absorbing some of those other necessary nutrients. So now, another reason not to use potash. You could be increasing the potassium levels within your soil to the point that the plant starves. There's so much nutrition that the plant can't absorb all of the other nutrition that it needs. So keep asking why. I got a comment today from the video that I did last night that questioned just about everything I said in that video by offering alternate recommendations. Well, the alternate recommendations weren't necessarily wrong. They've just been shown to not be the best practice. And what I tried to show in that video last night was based on research and recommendations coming from universities and is more current than some of those other things. So for instance, I show in that video how to make a heading cut when you prune your tree. You just cut the tree at that point. Why? I went into it a little bit, talking about why I made those pruning cuts. But what I didn't discuss was covering that wound on the tree with paint or honey or tar or one of the other things that you may have heard about. That when you prune off a branch of a tree, you're supposed to heal that wound, help the tree by painting that. Well, that has been completely debunked. Now, all reputable university sources say, do not paint a wound in a tree. Do not cover it up. What you're doing is not helping the tree, but potentially creating an environment between the tree and whatever you're using on that wound for bacteria and disease to set in. So, when somebody questions what you're doing or questions what I'm doing, ask why. If I say go ahead and prune off a branch and then leave it at that, and you've heard somebody else say that you should paint the wound, well, ask a question. Ask two questions. Why did Gardner Scott not paint that wound? And why is this other person telling me that I should paint that wound? That's how you become a better gardener. You start expanding your gardening knowledge so that as the advice comes in, you can start to weed out the stuff that you've learned is obviously wrong or has been supplanted by better information over time. Brand new gardeners, I totally understand and accept you just don't have the experience. And it's overwhelming. It's overwhelming for those of us that have been doing it for decades. There's always stuff to learn, but it starts by asking the question, why? I've said it before, I'll say it again. I may sound like a broken record, but this is how you become a better gardener. Don't blindly follow anybody that tells you how to do it, including me. There's a lot of great gardening methods out there. Back to Eden method of gardening. Wood chips throughout the garden, and you grow everything in wood chips. Works great in the Pacific Northwest. Doesn't work well for me, doesn't work well for a lot of other gardeners in Arizona and New Mexico. It also doesn't work well for gardeners in California. And I actually had a comment on my wood chip video this morning from an individual in California that pointed out if you use a lot of wood chips in your garden, you could be creating a fire hazard. I hadn't even really thought about that. When I lived in an area that was overrun by a wildfire, houses within a quarter mile of me were devastated. I was lucky. I learned to not have bark mulch next to my house because it is a potential fire hazard. I didn't take that to the next level and think if I suggest wood chips in the garden, that it could put you and your garden and your house in harm's way if you live in a wildfire area. Ask why. Don't just blindly accept advice. Take it to the next level and see if it works best for you and your garden. And that's another reason why I say get to know the gardeners in your area, because they've probably learned some of those lessons ahead of you and you won't make the same mistakes. So there's a little bit of my philosophy today. That's what's helped me get to the point that I know enough information to pass on to you. And I do anticipate that all of you will pay it forward and take some of the information you learn and pass it to another gardener. Pass the good information that you know to be good information because you've tested it, you've learned the right way to do it, you've asked why, and you're a better gardener as a result of all that. So there, I'm getting off of my soapbox. So many comments. We're holding above 200 subscribers or 200 viewers. I want to thank all of you who have subscribed and put me over the 100,000 mark. That's just absolutely amazing to me. I do encourage you to subscribe to make sure that you get your questions answered. I've spent almost 2 hours the last 2 days, each of the last 2 days, answering questions on my videos. I'm not going to be able to sustain that as the channel continues to grow. And today, for the first time, I did pass over a few of the comments and questions when I saw that they did not come from subscribers. Because if you subscribe to the Gardener Scott channel, a little icon appears next to your name. I apologize for that. I really want to answer everybody that I can. I just don't have the time for it. If you subscribe, just like we talked about earlier, if you put Gardener Scott in the comment, I'll see it. If you do a super chat, I'll see it. And on all the videos that I produce, if you are a subscriber, I'll see it. And it's much more likely that I'll give you that personal attention that I really want to give to you as a gardener to help become a better gardener. I thank all of you for the support, the encouragement. The videos are continuing to come. As I mentioned, the video that's coming on Wednesday is going to be square foot gardening. The video coming after that will be straw bale gardening. I'm working on a video for lasagna gardening. So this is the place to come for information, and I'll try to answer the question, why, when you ask it. And if I didn't adequately answer the question, then call me on it. And in the comments, say, but why? And I'll do all I can to expand on the topic so that you become a better gardener and it spreads to all of the rest of us. So my time is up. Thank you so much. I look forward to seeing you again next Monday. If you missed any portion of this live stream, it's going to appear as a video. You can catch up on it, and you can also comment. If you didn't get your comment answered today, and it is time sensitive, go ahead and go to the live stream replay and ask your question in the comments. And I'm much more likely to get to it and answer it in a timely manner if you do it that way. So lots of ways to get to me, and I'm doing all I can to get back to you. Look forward to seeing you. Appreciate all the support. Keep watching the videos. Keep up gardening. Keep having a great gardening week at every opportunity. I'm Gardener Scott. Enjoy gardening.